I'm Walter Kehm, and I was born in New York City, 1937, in December, just before Christmas. My parents were immigrants from Germany, and we grew up in New York with everybody working 2 jobs and not much money, but some wonderful experiences growing up in the city. Why does a person go into a certain vocation in life? What were the inspirations? And I have to say very much it was New York City. My mother, with her farming background, we always had Victory Gardens. One of the last remaining farms in New York City was just down the street, an Italian family. In high school, they offered garden science and general science. I elected to take garden science. And my playground was Prospect Park and Central Park and the Rockaway beaches and the wetlands around Kennedy Airport, at that time Idlewild. So I decided I'd like to leave the city, and I had the opportunity to go to Syracuse. And I was also interested in rowing, and Syracuse had rowing and forestry. So I spent the first 2.5 years at Syracuse. And after 2.5 years and 13 weeks surveying the Adirondack Mountains and looking at the value of spruce trees and board foot volumes and price per linear foot of lumber, I said no. And I met a friend named Harry Porter, who was in landscape architecture. Harry died a couple of years ago, but he went on to be the director of architecture at the University of Virginia, and a really good friend at that time. And I said, well, listen, I think I'd like to try landscape architecture. So I went to the head of the department at Syracuse, and he said, you know, it's going to cost you some time. It's going to be a 5-year program. I said, done. I'll go into landscape architecture. And it was really, to this day, it's an excellent program at Syracuse. Very much oriented to the public sector. And at the completion of my undergraduate work at Syracuse, I felt I wanted to do more with cities. I've always been interested in nature and cities, the farming experience in New York City, my parents. So I went to Harvard, and I wanted to study with Hideo Sasaki. And 2 years for my master's, dealing with urban landscape design. And after the completion of the work at Harvard, I was awarded the Wiedemann Fellowship, and that allowed me to go to Italy for 8 months to look at rural Italian development. Italian hill towns, of course, the Renaissance and the history of Italian evolution from the Etruscans, the Romans, the Medicis, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And those were the formative influences that led me to think in an international way about landscape architecture, which became, in retrospect, an important determinant for why I developed a practice the way I did. The reason I'm practicing the way I am to this day really started with my mother, who gave me a global interest. Global interest in, I mean, she was an inveterate reader of national parks and always interested in Africa and South America. And landscape architecture to me, particularly at Syracuse, where there was such an emphasis on forestry and trees, was global ecosystems, global climate. And when we graduated, and that's now 1960 at Syracuse and 62 at Harvard, the profession was still pretty young in the States as well. And so much of the work that was being done was, I called decoration. I mean, there was Olmsted and that tradition of parks, but many of the offices were doing planting plans for buildings and really dressing up the landscape. And at Harvard, we're very much involved with the Ian McCog's thinking, Sasnaki's thinking about the city in a regional context, landscape ecology as a determinant for form. So when I finished work in Rome, I received a phone call from Macklin Hancock, who was in Toronto at Project Planning Associates, and I met him when he was a visiting professor at Harvard. And at this point, my family and I were broke. We had the Harvard scholarship had run out, enough money for the airfare. And he said, look, we have two interesting projects, Expo 67 in Montreal and the University of Guelph Master Plan and Implementation. I said, whoa, that sounds really, really interesting. Because I had applied to other firms in Virginia and Reston, and I just didn't like the setting of these firms. They're very local, very provincial. Whereas landscape architecture and project planning associates was global in its thinking. Global in that it was interdisciplinary. They were integrating engineers and planners and ecologists and landscape architects and sociologists. And I said, this really suits my intellectual interest. Integration of people. We have collaborative teams working on large projects. So Guelph was a case in point, Expo 67. But from that, we won some competitions. We won the competition for the Kuwait waterfront. And then we began to develop a reputation in the Middle East. In 1967, we were invited to go to Pakistan, so I spent quite a bit of time developing low-cost housing. And that too had piqued my interest, because coming from a family with modest means, landscape architecture, meeting social needs of society, to me was very important. And so often I saw landscape architecture being high-end, dealing with people who had lots of money, or projects that were maybe not accessible to people of low income. And that became a driving force to this day. So all of a sudden, I found myself from Pakistan to Hong Kong, doing Lantau Island waterfront, to Australia, worked with the Canadian International Development Agency, developing regional plans for St. Lucia for a new airport, schools in Guyana, new town in the Bahamas. 1974, we were asked by the government of Tanzania to develop the plans for their new capital in Dodoma. And my family and I moved over to Tanzania. So for 15 years of my life, really was, on the plane in Nigeria, in London. The big commission was at about the same time as the work with President Nyerere in Dodoma, received the commission for the King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And we started an office in London, England, and Canadian landscape architects then went to London. Bruce Cudmore, who unfortunately has passed away, Patrick Lee, who is still president of EDA Collaborative. So we developed a landscape architecture firm that had a global presence. And in Canada, we also had major projects, one of which is Meadowvale, which is now Mississauga, 3,000 acres, designing this new community from scratch in 1968-69, a new town of the country. And this sort of followed on with Max Hancock's interest with Don Mills, Meadowvale, then Malvern, then Kanata in Ottawa. So the firm had this continuing interest in the people involved with the firm in urban development, integrating nature and culture. And I believe that we really were implementing the McCog ideals, the Sasaki ideals, starting with the landscape first, before we put a pencil to paper about density development, housing, and roads. And I think Meadowvale was very significant that way. The firm developed an office. We were asked by Mayor Drapeau. There have been lots of problems with Expo, and they had difficulty getting a plan approved. I guess it was Churchill was the head of the Expo Corporation, and he was very familiar with the work of Bob Calvert, who was with Project Planning Associates, who had an architectural company called Hancock Little Calvert. So suddenly we're thrust into the situation of, look, we need to get a plan together quickly. And because so many months had gone by, so project planning was retained to do a master plan for Expo, and then received the detailed landscape commission for Ile Notre Dame. I think Don Graham was involved with Ile Saint-Hélène, and Dick Strong's office then had the amusement park. And so we developed a practice then in Montreal next to Moshe Safdie's office. It was an amazing time. Safdie had Habitat. We were all young. We all drank too much wine. But we were involved with the design of everything on Ile Notre Dame in terms of detail, the pedestrian walkway systems, the planting, the little the B line, A line, the monorail system going through the American Pavilion, the design of Inco Plaza, places like that, significant places. And we had a fellow named John Burroughs, who was a landscape architect from Michigan, who was leading that work in Montreal. So the Toronto office and the Montreal office worked closer together. The design of the monorails, why they went through the American Pavilion and the over the water, the whole thing was designed to be experiential. So you're up and down and through buildings and out of buildings, above the trees, below the trees. And transportation as a fun experience, as an experience in its own right. The other fun experiences, and maybe not so much fun, was working with such a diversity of architects and how to blend egos, because everybody had to have their building. Mesa Du Bois with the Canada Pavilion, the French, pavilion, the British and the Russian pavilion. So how to integrate with all these diverse architects and get them on stream as to the bigger picture. And I think this is where landscape architects have a big role to this day, seeing a bigger picture, having a vision that people can then say, yeah, that's a pretty good idea, let's buy into it. After going to Harvard as a visiting professor, and I had left Project Planning Associates in 1976, my former colleagues at Project Planning called me, and they were not happy. After I left and stepped down as head of landscape architecture, there was a lot of dissension within the company. And we had developed a very close landscape architecture unit. At one point we had 28 landscape architects in a landscape unit of over 50 people. Projects all over the world, landscape architects in Hong Kong, Australia, London, Africa. It was quite an interesting group of people. I stepped down and things were not going well politically in the company. Patrick Lee, Ron Tattershaw, Bruce Cudmore called me up in Cambridge and they said, Walter, we'd like to develop a new company. I said, sounds good. I really respected these people. And came back to Toronto. We were in the basement, sitting on stools in the basement, and said, what are we going to call this company? And we call it Environmental Design Associates, or EDA Collaborative, the idea of collaboration of different disciplines. And we registered that company, and within a year, invitation from friends of mine, Alf Savage became Commissioner of Parks in Edmonton. Walter, we have a job for you in Edmonton, but you have to have an office here. Okay, so 6 months in Edmonton, 6 months in Toronto, back and forth. Johnson's Island Provincial Park, the Edmonton Downtown Amenities Study, Transmission Line Corridors, Garden Lake First Nations Study, all these wonderful things happening in Alberta. And we're now into 1986, and we had finished work on the David Crombie Apartments and the St. Lawrence Market Housing, which was a major housing project, which again is part of my interest in multiple use housing, low-income housing, designing for people with minimum means, with Regent Park Community Development Plan. That was a major commission, a year almost living in Regent Park. And we did the redevelopment plan and received a $4 million construction contract to build ball diamonds, build ice rinks, build swimming pools. The Regent Park was 80% asphalt and fencing. So working with the low-income people was an amazing experience to be able to do something for people there. By 1986, questions came again as to where we were going. Cameron Mann stepped down as the director at the University of Guelph. Victor Chinasik had been there before that, started the program in '67. And I said, I think I'd like to go back into academia because I had been at Harvard. So I put my hat into the ring, and lo and behold, they said, hey, would you like to be the director of the School of Landscape Architecture? I said, yeah, sure. So from 1986 to 2000, I was the director of the school, and we developed a 5-year program. We A records in our accreditation for the American Society, Canadian Society. I feel very proud about that because when I took over, the program was at a low point in accreditation. And we built up quite a reputation at the university. We were seen to be invisible. Landscape architects are not the best for promoting themselves. And suddenly our faculty and myself were head of committees at the university, a lot of publicity in the newspapers, student awards, Winterfest, book awards, all these things were happening. And 2000 though, they said, dear man, you're 65, you have no value anymore, you must leave. And I said, really? Mandatory retirement? I said, oh, Zito there. Okay. It's a fascinating question to think back in my career. It's 53 years now. And what makes Walter tick? What makes Johnny tick, you know? And you have to go back to your roots. And my roots were always in landscape and culture and nature. And the University of Guelph became one of the major projects because here at Landscape Architects, we're coordinating all the environmental studies. We're coordinating 12 different architectural firms, 6 different engineering firms, planning firms, dealing with the university on an administrative basis. And the whole idea of building a new city where nature and planting and landscape and buildings were fused into one conception. And the idea then of the pedestrian street. I went to Cambridge to pick the red brick paving stones out of a Cambridge sidewalk, put them in my attaché case, brought them across the border and presented them to the Board of Governors. I said, Guelph should have brick walkways because most of the buildings would either be limestone or concrete. And that fight was pivotal because we were successful in developing the brick walkways. So the pedestrian streets, all the buildings fronting on the pedestrian street, cars behind everything within a 10-minute walking distance. To me, that simple gesture of a simple diagram has stood the test of time to this day. It continues to guide the development. Now we're 2018, new buildings are still reflecting that pedestrian idea. So Guelph became to me important because I could deal with landscape theory. We had a steam tunnel system and we had a brick walkway. I said, why can't we take the excess heat from the steam tunnel, run it under the walkway so we don't have to use salt? We built it. Snow and wind were big issues, not so much today as it was in the 60s and 70s, 7 or 8 foot drifts. Wind tunnel studies, snow, I have all the photographs documenting the snow tunnel studies. We had Professor Theakston, who had a snow flume, tunnel flume, at the university. That company, from the original days at the University of Guelph, is now RWDI, one of the world's leading companies predicting climate effects on building design. And we did those tests to find out where we're going to have main entries of buildings, where we're going to have snow deposition issues, where we're going to have uncomfortable human wind conditions. Those were pioneering studies that led to the planting plan, to the design of buildings, and it all came out of a conception of landscape architecture that was very holistic. So Guelph stands out as, to me, a pivotal project in my career. But after that, so many things were unfolding. I mentioned the Dodoma, the planning the new capital of Tanzania, working with the president and the cabinet to do all the landscape plans, site opportunity constraints, suitability studies, water, climate, vegetation, agriculture. All those landscape studies were done before we even put a pencil to paper for the new city. A city that was going to be planned for 800,000. It's sort of like Ottawa. Ottawa was about 500,000 at the time. We were planning a capital based on open space systems, based on agriculture, based on urban food production, because we were dealing with Dodoma in the middle of the country, a penal uh, prison, a major psychiatric hospital. The Doma was seen as the dead end. And how do you create a new image for the city? And it was based on landscape. High points, low points, river valleys, seasonal monsoons, heritage, Livingston and Stanley, where they walked from Dar es Salaam to the Lake Victoria. Wonderful job, wonderful opportunity. That also related to Expo because we had to deal with bus transportation, bicycle transportation, pedestrian transportation. So here you have Expo, Guelph, and Dodoma, all the new capital of Tanzania, all coming together as a holistic idea of movement, of sustainable thinking, of agriculture, of transportation, and of course housing. Certainly the joy of living with landscape, the joy of introducing nature to cities, the joy of seeing my clients feel so comfortable with the work I've designed, the joy of seeing children play on rocks, swim in clean water, the joy of watching trees grow from the University of Guelph. Those first trees planted in 1967 and 68, working with Gary Hildeman. Their first project was the student housing complex where we introduced Carolinian materials, Cercis canadensis. It won't grow. It's still there to this day, the rhododendrons, the tulip trees. To see the evolution of landscapes over the years that bring so much comfort to people. I think that that's just the beauty of landscape, to be able to yourself observe landscapes changing. Tommy Thompson Park, to remember that in the 80s, to see now developing forests, developing wetlands, a living ecosystem 10 minutes from downtown Toronto. Trillium Park is the same idea. Conservation by design. Create the substrate, create the basis, and then let nature fill in the blanks. High spots, low spots, dry slopes, wet slopes, windy slopes, calm slopes. Ecosystem for quiet places. I think that's the kind of challenge we face in landscape architecture. Let nature do its thing, not try and plan everything, not try and design everything to the last detail, but create a substrate where nature can take over the city.